This conference will now be recorded.
Hello class, we are continuing on with our nervous system unit in physiology, and we've already discussed a few things, including your introduction to nervous tissue, the structure of axons, and the organization of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We also talked about different kinds of cells or neuroglial cells that aren't neurons that are supportive to the nervous system. We also touched on cranial nerves, and I want to kind of go back here and talk about each of the cranial nerves in more detail. So if you go back to your notes, I've added a few slides. So cranial nerves are part of your peripheral nervous system, just like, say, the median nerve of your arm. The cranial nerves perform certain functions. The difference here is that unlike the peripheral nervous system in your arms and legs, they are mixed nerves, meaning that they carry sensory information into the spinal column. Okay, so like up into the, let's give you an example here. They carry sensory information into the spinal column, the central nervous system, and may or may not be relayed to the brain, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Simple reflexes remain in the spinal cord and really don't need the brain's involvement, but higher function thinking and processing would require some input from the brain. With that being said, motor nerves are then released from the central nervous system, the spinal cord, or brainstem. And signals or action potentials or impulses are sent to effector cells. That could be a muscle or a gland. So cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, but the difference is that some of them are sensory nerves, some of them have only motor function, and some of them have both, which is mixed. So that's something important to pay attention to. And they're all designated by Roman numerals, and you do have to know them by both their name and the Roman numerals. The Roman numerals really reflect its position or order in the brainstem itself, going from inferior to superior, or sorry, superior to inferior in numbers. So like, say your cranial nerves 1 and 2 are more on the anterior aspect of the brainstem, or superior aspect, I guess I should say, where the cranial nerve number 12 is found lower down on the brainstem, closer to the spinal cord. Cranial nerve number 1 is your olfactory nerve. This is your sense of smell, and how that really comes to be is there's a plate or a bony area that has holes in it where nerves extend down into your nasal cavity. All right, and these free nerve endings pick up dissolved chemicals in your mucosa, and when they attach to this receptor, it triggers an impulse. Okay, it reaches threshold and provides an impulse into centers of the brain that process smells. What I need you to know is that the olfactory nerve senses smell, and there's one of them. So you can see all of the sensory receptors, and then the olfactory bulb, which is just one nerve on each side of the body. Okay, so that's that. We're going to come back to that later on in our lecture today. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The optic nerve number 2, we have 2 eyes, and they stem from the optic chiasm bilaterally. So we have 2 eyes, right? They go to both places. And what this is a sensory nerve only. And different cells on the retina pick up photons, which is light energy, and stimulate these receptors, which then are relayed into the optic nerve. Okay, so all of these, the retina is at the back of the eyeball, and this is where all of the sensory photoreceptors are located. and they converge on an optic nerve, which then relays the sensory information back into the brainstem and is processed in the brain in vision centers. Oculomotor nerve, or cranial nerve number 3, is a motor nerve only. Okay, so no sensory input from this nerve. And you can see that there are 3 nerves. Okay, these are different cranial nerves that I'm demonstrating in this photograph. Your eyes move in many different directions and require different muscles that are innervated by different nerves to do so. And so you're going to have the oculomotor nerve, which is cranial nerve number 3, the trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 4, and the abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve number 6. Remembering 3, 4, and 6 move the eyeballs. That's important. I mean, it could be important. I can't say for sure, but remembering that those are the nerves that move the eyeball and is a motor nerve. Trochlear nerve, we just discussed it, also a movement of the eyeball. Trigeminal cranial nerve number 5 is a, well, you know, I don't know why this is the largest cranial nerve, because I would actually argue that, but so I'm just going to delete it because I don't agree with that. It's a mixed nerve, meaning it has sensory and motor function. Okay, and there's branches off this nerve. So we can see the trigeminal nerve and several branches off of it. This is one cranial nerve. Okay, that's different than what I just showed you, where these are actually 3 different cranial nerves stemming off the brainstem. Trigeminal is one, and there branches off of that ganglion. So they are picking up sensory information off of the face, alrighty, and then they are also providing motor function to the muscles of mastication. This is basically your eating muscles. So when you clench your jaw and you feel the muscle tone, really that's how you're assessing the trigeminal motor function, as if you're clenching their teeth and assessing the muscles of mastication and observing their equal tone bilaterally. There's our friendly abducens again. Abducens is for lateral eyeball rotation, along with the other cranial nerves 3 and 4 move in the eye in all the cardinal directions all together. Facial nerve, which I've talked to you about before, is the 7th cranial nerve. It's also a mixed nerve. So the sensory portion of the facial nerve is not to pick up touch and sensation off the face, but more about the sense of taste in the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay, so that's picking up sensory information for taste on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and relaying that information back up into the brainstem, which is then processed in the gustatory centers of the brain. The motor portion has to do with facial expression rather than the muscles of mastication. So yes, facial expression is the motor division. The vestibulocochlear nerve, oh my gosh, is a cranial nerve number 8, and it has 2 different functions, and we're going to come back to this as well. It's a sensory cranial nerve and it has no motor function. It originates in the inner ear, where you can kind of see in this diagram some really funky looking fun things. We have a semicircular canal, the vestibule with cochlear cochlea area, which looks kind of like a snail, right, in your inner ear. This is your tympanic membrane, and you can see the eustachian tube. This is the portion of your body that connects your middle ear to your throat. That's why when you have an ear ache or a cold, you have ear involvement and throat involvement, because it opens into the throat, or the pharynx. And in children, while they're developing, the eustachian tube is actually a little bit more horizontal. And for that reason, it doesn't drain properly. So whenever you have accumulation of fluid somewhere, this is where infections are likely to occur. And yeah, kids that need tubes in their ears usually have an altered anatomy where their eustachian tubes may be a little bit more horizontal. But at any rate, we're talking about the sense of hearing and equilibrium having to do with the ear. And that's the structure in the inner ear. The cochlear branch carries the impulse for hearing, where the vestibular branch has to do more for the sense of equilibrium. The glossopharyngeal nerve is a mixed cranial nerve, and it is responsible for the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the taste there. That's the sensory part. The motor part has to do with the release of saliva. Vagus nerve, which is, I think, the most interesting, and I would argue the largest nerve, cranial nerve of the body. It originates in the brain stem, but its branches serve many organs of the body and is really something that as a manual therapist you can have a lot of influence on. It's a mixed cranial nerve, meaning that it has sensory and motor division. It is distributed from the head and neck into the thorax and the abdomen to serve those organs. The sensory portion has to do with the sensing of proprioception, position in space, and stretching, whereas the motor neurons feed impulses to the pharynx, larynx, and soft palate, which is involved in swallowing and vocalization. Oh my goodness. So this is not testable. I thought this is a cool little tidbit for your information, but the gut-brain axis is a real thing that's been studied by medical sciences, and what it is a bidirectional communication between the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is your gut brain. It connects cognitive, so thoughts, and digestive behavior. The gut microbiome has been shown to have a huge influence on mental health for this reason, and they believe that there's the gut-brain axis or connection that is influenced by the gut microbiome. Psychological factors influence physiology of the gut. For example, if you've ever been nervous about a test or a big day, maybe you felt like vomiting or getting the runs. Right? Stress will also increase perception of pain sensation from the gut. So if somebody has something going on in their gut, it's not maybe quite right, and they're stressed out, it's going to enhance the sensation of pain that they're feeling. You can learn more about the gut-brain axis or connection by checking out this YouTube video. It's not testable, it's for your information only, but I thought it was pretty cool. The accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 11, is a motor cranial nerve only, and this is feeding impulses to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles to coordinate movements of the head. The hypoglossal nerve is a motor nerve, and it is involved in speech and swallowing. What other nerve was involved in swallowing and speech? If you said the vagus nerve, you're right. It's feeding, the motor division is feeding impulses to the pharynx, larynx, and soft palate. All right, so then we're going to fast forward now in your slide notes to slide number 53. I think it is, hopefully it still is on yours. You're looking for the peripheral nervous system sensory structures and functions. So today we're going to be talking about sensory receptors and how our sensation of the outer world, the environment or the stimulus that creates a action potential or a nerve impulse, is even perceived by our brain as some sort of interpretation. So even though it's only light energy coming into our eyes, our brains can make images and pictures and process and understand color. So that's kind of cool. There's a really cool summary video. Of course, I love Crash Course on the peripheral nervous system and pain. It is fast-paced, but it is a good resource to come back to when you're reviewing for like the midterm or whatever, or your CBAs. As it's very concise, it's 10 minutes, but it gives you like all the information and it can really help give you a nice overview. Okay, so we know some of these things already, but let's just recap. Sensory receptors detect a stimulus that carries sensory impulses to the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. The sensation is based on that interpretation of the impulse by the brain, which is called perception. When you have sustained stimulus, so a receptor is constantly being stimulated, a receptor may undergo something called adaptation, which means that the continuous stimulus no longer is going to produce a action potential that's strong enough to create an effect. And they're desensitized. And this also decreases the rate of the impulses sent to the central nervous system. Receptors that pick up information and that relay a response aren't, they're not saying, oh, I'm picking up the color red. What they'll do is they will kind of act in Morse code, like doot, 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 doot. They'll have like a rate of impulse. And if something's very stimulating, that rate will increase. So do, 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 right? Threshold's always exactly the same, but it is the rate of this impulse that really makes a big difference. If you have a receptor that's desensitized, you need to increase the rate of impulses or the intensity of that in order to sense it again or turn it back on. There's two categories of sensory receptors, general receptors and special receptors. For massage therapists, it's really important to focus on the general receptors. That's what you can influence, although having an awareness of these special receptors is also kind of part of your curriculum. So we're going to touch on that, and it also helps to enhance your understanding of how the nervous system actually works. So there's 6 types of sensory receptors. Photoreceptors pick up light. Chemoreceptors are sensitive to chemical changes. Thermoreceptors, these are stimulated by temperature. Nociceptors are pain receptors. Mechanoreceptors pick up pressure and movement. And proprioceptors are localized in skeletal muscle and joints, and they really pick up your position in space, your body, spatial awareness, that kind of thing. There's a table in your textbook 7.2 that summarizes this quite nicely, and I've just included it here as a quick reference. Okay, the first one we're going to talk about are photoreceptors, and as I mentioned before when we were talking about the cranial nerve number 2, the oculomotor nerve, no, the optic nerve, what am I talking about? It's a sensory receptor, no motor function. The optic nerve is connected to the retina in the back of the eye. So you can also see it here where the yellow is the nervous tissue. And you can see that there's receptors attached to the retina of the eye, and the receptors are called rods and cones. Rods pick up the dark, like the black and white receptors, where cones are picking up bright light and specific color wavelengths. We have receptors for blue, red, and green. I mean, most people do, unless you're colorblind, then you can't differentiate between green and red. And that's just due to the concentration of receptors or the existence of receptors in your eye. So the rods and cones are stimulated by light waves, photons, that pass through the eye, okay, through this direction, through the cornea and lens, and then they hit the back of the eye on the retina. And this stimulates these receptors, which then relays sensory information through the optic nerve. or cranial nerve number 2. And then that's interpreted by visual centers in the brain, so that you're picking up and stimulating certain receptors, and your brain is sensing, oh, I'm seeing blue, because it's associating something that's learned or conditioned with blue, the word blue, or other things that are blue, like water, the sky, and so on and so forth. Chemoreceptors are embedded in the epithelial and mucosal tissue of the nose and the mouth. There is a strong connection between the sense of smell, which is olfaction, and taste. And as I mentioned before, where those receptors are found and how that all works, but gas molecules of inhaled air are dissolved in the nasal fluid and picked up by these receptors. So when you're smelling something good, like, baked cookies, you're actually getting pieces of molecules attaching to these receptor sites and conveying an impulse through the olfactory bulb, which is cranial nerve number 1, and sent to different olfactory centers in the brain to relate, oh, this is grandma's cookie recipe, or I love these, it makes me feel so good, or ooh, it smells like somebody was in the bathroom before me and I want to get out of here. There's a fast sensory adaptation. That's why you can actually not smell something after a while, or maybe not smell yourself when you're in the washroom if it was you. Kind of gross to think about these dissolved molecules that are in your nasal fluid. Think about that next time you smell something bad. We also have chemoreceptors as gustatory cells that are chemoreceptors for taste. Oops, sorry about that. You have taste buds all over your tongue that are located in things called papillae, which are tiny bumps on the tongue's surface. There's different regions of the tongue that have higher sensitivities to different kinds of chemicals based on these types of receptors. So generally, the sweet is more on the tip of the tongue, sour is more on the edges, where bitter is at the back. The 4 basic tastes are sweet, sour, sweet, and salty, sweet, sour, and bitter. And they also have fast sensory adaptation, which means your first bite might be very powerful and tasty and slowly diminishes and desensitizes as you move through the meal. It's kind of cool, like in Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, they put a lot of emphasis on the taste, especially Ayurvedic medicine, to balance out the body. And here is your direct link, right? You have receptors attached to these taste buds that feed into the brainstem of your central nervous system. So I think there's something to it. It's definitely stimulating and can have an influence.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, moving along here. Another chemoreceptor that we have is to monitor chemicals in our central spinal fluid or the blood. This is substances that are dissolved in this fluid, right? The plasma of the blood or the cerebral spinal fluid. These are general sensory chemoreceptors as opposed to special sensory receptors of taste and smell. Okay, remember that distinction when I was talking to you about general receptors and special receptors. General receptors are scattered throughout the body: skin, muscles, fascia, joints, blood vessels, and special organs are located only eyes, nose, ears, and tongue. All right, so back to our general sensory chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors in your blood vessels and your cerebral spinal fluid are picking up and monitoring levels of your pH, your body's pH, carbon dioxide, oxygen, carbon monoxide, of course, would probably be in there too. But these are the ones I need you to know. And they will pick up the sensory information and relay that. So here's some chemical chemoreceptors. We'll relay that information back into the centers of the brain in order to stimulate changes in the respiratory and cardiovascular function. So for example, if your chemoreceptors are detecting a drop in oxygen levels, it will, in a normal, healthy person, will influence homeostasis by relaying that information back into respiratory centers of the brain to encourage deeper or more frequent breaths. Cardiovascular reflexes will pick up these sensations as well and influence different movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen across the membrane. Nociceptors, which are very interesting for us in healthcare to help people with pain. Pain is really just a warning signal of tissue damage. So it's a good thing, even though it can be a huge nuisance. It is slowly adapting receptors. So the stimulus continues to cause the sensation of pain, even though it is a constant stimulation, which is why it's such a pest. Oops. Pain receptors are specialized free nerve endings and found in the skin, joint capsules, fascia, periosteum. Periosteum, if you recall, is the outer membrane of bone. Blood vessel walls also have these nociceptors. There's 3 types of pain receptors and they react to different stimuli. You can have mechanical damage to tissues or extreme temperatures or chemicals, including those released from damaged cells, which is part of your inflammatory response. So all human beings have the exact same pain threshold, which will generate the action potential to start with, right? You have to reach that minus 50 millivolts in order for an action potential to propagate anyway. So that doesn't change. You know, the more stimulus doesn't equal more pain, it just means it's reached the threshold. But we all have different pain perceptions. Perceptions are something that occurs in the brain and are influenced and modified by many factors. Some are conscious, some are unconscious. Some can be related to experiences or how somebody's handling stress, or, right, there's so many things. We're going to talk more about pain later on in this unit, not today, but we will definitely go there. I just want to introduce you to the receptors. Thermoreceptors are picking up a sensation of warm or cold. So to contrast these, they're both free nerve endings. There's usually less warm receptors in a given area and far more cold receptors. Warm receptors are found in the dermal layer of the skin, where the cold receptors are found more in the epidermal layer of the skin, so more superficial. They're stimulated by temperatures, and if it is important, your textbook wants you to know this. They're stimulated by temperatures that are different, and if they're outside this range, they trigger pain. The temperatures for the warm is anywhere between 32 and 48 degrees Celsius, where cold receptors are stimulated by anything between 10 and 40 degrees. They both adapt quickly. That's why when you get into a hot tub and you think you're boiling alive for the first 30 seconds, you begin to accommodate it and get quite comfortable in there. Same with even cold water. After you kind of warm it or get used to it, right? You don't sense the cold as strongly as you initially did. All right, mechanoreceptors are sensitive to touch, pressure, stretch, compression, and torsion. There's really 3 functional categories of mechanoreceptors, and they're going to fit in one of these. Tactile receptors, which are touch, baroreceptors, which have to do with pressure, and mechanoreceptors, which have to do with hearing. All right, we'll start with tactile receptors first. There's a few that you may have remembered from the skin unit. as they're located mostly in the epidermis and dermal layer, well, the dermal layer, the upper and the deeper dermal layers. In the upper dermis, you're going to find your free nerve endings, okay, which are these ones that don't have any sort of specialized end to them. Merkel discs, which are located right here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. They're depicting it here as this one, those little larger bulbs. And then the Meissner corpuscles, which I was pointing to earlier. Okay. And then the deeper receptors are the Pacinian corpuscles, which are lamellated, which means that they are going to be picking up pressure. So deeper sensation is going to influence or stimulate these receptors. Ruffini corpuscles, and also the hair root plexus, which is wrapped around the hair follicle itself. So deeper stimulation is needed for these receptors to be triggered, where light touch tickles are going to trigger the free nerve endings, Merkel discs, and Meissner corpuscles. Proprioceptors are of significance for manual therapists because stimulating this group of mechanoreceptors can have a therapeutic effect. The major types are joint receptors, muscle spindles, and Golgi tendon organs. We talked about these when we were talking about the muscle skeletal section of your unit last term. So we'll just revisit them real quickly. Joint receptors, of course, are found embedded in the joints, and they're picking up pressure, tension, and movement. Here we have our Pacinian corpuscles again and our free nerve endings. In the muscle belly, you're going to have the muscle spindle, and it's detecting changes in length of the muscle, so really the stretch. A stretch reflex is going to result in a contraction of the muscle in order to prevent overstretching of the muscle, potentially causing damage. The Golgi tendon organ monitors changes in contraction. When your muscle contracts, the tendon squeezes on the tendon organs and stimulates the nerve to understand that there is some kind of contraction happening. The inverse stretch reflex inhibits the contraction by releasing the muscle, and then the Golgi tendon organ is no longer stimulated. These receptors combine to create the kinesthetic sense, which is awareness of movement, body position, spatial relationship between your body parts so that you have coordinated movement. And this is ongoing.
Can I fix this?
So it's just a zoom in picture. Here we've got the muscle spindle and the muscle belly, and the Golgi tendon organ within the tendon of the muscle. Just to recall the reflex arc that we talked about before, this is the simple neuronal pathway where a sensation, okay, stimulated from the muscle spindle is relayed into the central nervous system where it synapses on a motor neuron, triggering a contraction in order to prevent the muscle from overstretching. This isn't testable, but for your information only. Sensory deprivation used in float tanks have been shown in studies to be helpful with certain kinds of symptoms. They claim that this lack of sensory input can really calm somebody down. It calms down the central nervous system. It can have a person left feeling rejuvenated, potentially easing their anxiety, relaxing muscles, and reducing pain. There's no lights. You're floating in highly magnesium concentrated water, which gives you buoyancy. Just a second. Buoyancy, and taking the pressure or the stimulation off of these proprioceptors and less input to the central nervous system, where some funky things can actually happen. There's also no special senses happening either, because you're usually wearing earplugs and there's no lights on, so that's also an added sensory deprivation. All right, we're almost there. We have just a couple of more mechanoreceptors to talk about. Baroreceptors is another. Again, specialized free nerve endings that detect pressure. They're a pressure receptor that are found in certain hollow organs in the elastic layer. So I've given you the example of in blood vessels, where you're having these baroreceptors in the carotid arteries, as well as the aorta, and they're monitoring pressure of the blood flow on the walls of the arteries. And that can give information to the central nervous system to control the heart rate, and also the diameter of blood vessels. You're also going to have these receptors, these baroreceptors, in respiratory tracts, urinary tracts, digestive tract. They're all interrelated, and we will be talking about that when we come to the endocrine system and how that maintains homeostasis. Yeah, for example, like if your baroreceptors in your blood vessels are detecting high pressure, it will actually stimulate your kidneys to release more water to decrease the pressure in your blood. All right, and finally, the last mechanoreceptor is in the ear. And this mechanoreceptor, as I mentioned before, is related to the vestibulocochlear nerve or cranial nerve number 8. Okay, both hearing and equilibrium. So for hearing, you have these tiny hair-like extensions located in the ear that pick up vibrational stimulus caused by the sound waves, and then the hairs in this region bend, okay, to the waves. They're attached to receptors, the nervous system, which relays the sensory information through the vestibulocochlear nerve or cranial nerve 8, which will then bring information to the brain and be assessed in auditory centers to be interpreted as a music or somebody talking or just an irritating noise. Equilibrium is also managed or monitored in the ear. Receptors in the semicircular canal, okay, that's this kind of wild roller coaster structure, are stimulated by changes in head and body position. So really there's like fluid in your semicircular canals, and there's little receptors or megaliths, otoliths. They're called otoliths. They're little ear stones that are floating around in this fluid in this canal, and they monitor position, body position, so your head spinning mostly, gravity, acceleration, deceleration. When there's a problem in this region, with age or with extreme head movements, like say going on roller coasters all day or something like that, the otoliths can be misplaced. And when they're misplaced, it will alter the sensory information that's delivered to the central nervous system, and you actually will feel like the room is spinning, even though you are completely still.
Yeah.
This is a really common problem, and it can, if you've suffered from it once, it's likely to recur. But there's a really quick solution to it, actually, where a physician, naturopathic doctor, physiotherapist possibly, can actually put a person's head into certain positions. You can actually do this on your own too. It kind of looks like a somersault while you're doing weird head positions, but you're actually moving the auto position with these head positions and can re-establish the equilibrium sensory information that's delivered there. You have dynamic equilibrium and static equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium is defined as balance during movement. So while you're on a roller coaster and you're going upside down, you can perceive that you're upside down, or that you're moving and everything's balanced so you don't trip and fall or fall over. Like you might when you've spun around in circles, right? And then try to walk. Right, it is your receptors and your semicircular canals that are helping you manage your understanding of your head position in space. Static equilibrium has to do with your posture and stability while you're at rest. Alrighty, so that's it for our lecture today. Thank you for your attention to class, and I look forward to any questions that you have for me, and we will be talking soon. Have yourself a wonderful day. Bye.
Hey, Mommy, it's my turn.